We are very fortunate to be hosting the illustrious Mary Tom Poppendieck, who really hardly need any introduction. Mary and Tom are authors of inspiring, much-loved books on lean, well-known speakers on the lean and agile circuit. They've delivered inspiring presentations and keynotes at numerous conferences. If you haven't had a chance to hear them, then hopefully there's an opportunity sometime in the future to take advantage of that live. But in the meantime, we have them here tonight, and so really looking forward to the conversation. And so, Jeff, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Wonderful, Tom. Thanks so much, and thanks for the introduction of getting us teed up perfectly here. Mary and Tom, welcome so much to Agile Toronto, even though it is virtual, but welcome, and thanks for taking the time to chat with me and all of us this evening. I thought it would be fun if we could start maybe with a little bit of your background. Maybe if you could take us back into the 80s and 90s a little bit, and just
come on, I'm going back further than that.
All right, go back further. I didn't want you to go back too far, but you go back as far as you'd like then. Let's just start off there, if that's okay.
I'm going to start with my first job out of college because it was a programming job. And I worked for Bell Labs. And I was programming in a telephone switching computer, the number 2 ESS, number 2 electronic switching system. The number 1 switching system went into service in Schenectady, New York in 1965. This was 1967, and Bell Labs had just opened a laboratory in Naperville, Illinois, and they were working on a switching system for suburbs, smaller sites. That was the number 2 ESS system. It was a massive, whole room thing. It had spinning drums for storage, which was really better than the hand-wired magnetic cores of the number 1 ESS. And I worked there for a year. Then Tom decided to go ahead and get a PhD in physics. So we got married and moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where for quite a few years, I worked on the Aladdin project. And the Aladdin project was by Murray Thompson. He coordinated programming the bubble chambers that are produced in bubble chambers in those accelerators. So you take films, 3-dimensional films, and what the system I was programming did was it projected those, it took a digital scan of the 3 films, projected them into space and found tracks, and then put the tracks on a mag tape so that they could be analyzed in a big computer. So it was a really sophisticated control system of all of that hardware back when the computers we were working on were sort of fire sale computers from a company that had gone bankrupt trying to mimic the IBM 360. And I did mini computer programming for quite a while, controlling big equipment, and then eventually ended up in Minnesota, where we are now. And since I had all of this experience, I talked to my deck salesman in Madison and said, so who's hiring people like me in Minnesota? And he directed me to 3M, where they were looking for people to program in the engineering department to control equipment, big process equipment, that makes 3M tape and that sort of stuff. So I worked in the engineering department at 3M, programming again for, I worked there for 20 years, and easily the first 6 or 8 years I was programming control systems. I never worked in an IT department. I always thought that computers that made equipment move were the best things in the world. And that was what was the fun part. And learned to program in an engineering department and learned to think about programming as a branch of engineering, because basically that's what it was called at the time. And that's where I was working, in an engineering department with engineers who used to do what I did in computers. They did it in wires. So maybe they were electronic engineers or mechanical engineers. I just happened to do it in software instead. And I did that for a while. And then I worked in other areas in 3M, mostly in the same, doing various stuff with computers in the engineering department. until I worked in management of a division where we were putting products on the market that had software. We were selling basically to engineering departments, interestingly enough. Big aperture card, took films of drawings and put these films in big drawers and sent the drawers out on planes or shipyards. And that's how, before drawings were imaged in computers, that's how you figured out how to repair planes and ships and stuff like that. And so I left 3M in 1998 and 9, I think, the turn of the year there. And I did some work as a project manager, and I was appalled because the way that software was being done was nothing like I had ever thought of software in my life. I had never heard the word waterfall until that point in time. Never heard it. Never understood the concept or how it could work. Turns out it didn't work, but people thought it did. And so I decided to write a book about how you would think about software if you were doing a lean project, because one of the things I did was I was a manager at an IT manager at a manufacturing plant where one of my systems had gone. And we brought lean into that plant. We basically threw out our computers and started doing manual scheduling with Kanban cards. And it was a very successful lean implementation in our plants. And I think, that stuff that we learned in manufacturing for lean, those same principles, they might work better than this big waterfall thing. So that's how my first book got written in 2000, 2001 timeframe. And then for the last 20 years, mind you, 20 years, can you believe that? But we've been writing books and giving talks and stuff like that about developing software. Haven't done so much actual coding in that period of time, except for myself here. But my background is pretty much engineering computing.
I started out as a high school physics teacher in the Washington, D.C. area. And looking back, I see that what I was really doing at that time was teaching students how to apply mental models of the world to manipulate, to address, to understand what was going on around them. And this business of choosing a mental model and understanding its limitations, understanding its power, and understanding its weakness is something that's stayed with me forever since. As Mary mentioned, I went from high school teacher to get a doctorate in solid state physics. And at that stage, I added computers. Now, what we called computers back then were these big machines that ate punched cards. And I had to develop my own graphics drivers in order to drive a attached pen plotter, in order to analyze the data from my PhD research. I went from there to a position as a physics professor here in the Twin Cities, and again, continued helping people at a somewhat higher level now understand and apply mental models of how the universe works for various areas. At that time, I also wrote a grant that brought a PDP 11 and eventually a VAX 750. Does anybody remember those? Most of you probably are much too young. And it was a time-sharing system. We crawled through the steam tunnels and hooked up teletypes all through the campus and current loops. And it was quite an experience. I went from there to working for Honeywell, and we developed the navigation systems for commercial airplanes. You still fly on those navigation systems today. And there I learned about how to make sure that airplanes don't crash into mountains unintentionally. I assure you, those systems are safe. But many of the techniques that they used are finally appearing in the software world. From there, I went to be a consultant, teaching object-oriented technology in the 90s to companies that wanted to catch up to where the world had evolved. I had actually developed the rational unified process myself before they published their version, at which point it wasn't worth continuing with mine. But that's where I first experienced the way software evolves, where there is a set of activities and motions and insights in the community, which almost synthesize themselves into more generally understood movements. And of course, at the end of the 90s, the emerging synthesis that happened, we now call Agile. And Agile, of course, is now 20 years old. And we have to be looking at what is emerging today, because something that emerged 20 years ago, in many aspects, I think we have to consider somewhat obsolete. It is something that has been better than what came before, just like the unified process was better than waterfall. Waterfall was, well, wait a minute, waterfall wasn't better than anything. But things are evolving. The DevOps things have changed some of the fundamental assumptions under Agile. The microservices architectures have changed, but most important, what's changed since the 90s, when a bunch of consultants synthesized Agile as a way to do what they were told by, quote, the business, unquote. Things have changed to, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't work. Because what we tell these developer people to do turns out not to be what we really needed. We have to be very closely involved with them and work with them as partners, not as external consultants.
Or cost centers.
Or cost centers to do what they've been told. So that is what I'm seeing here, that Agile is no longer where it's at. It is the digitization of organizations enabled by the DevOps, enabled by modern architectures, enabled by the cloud, that totally changes the context, the mental model that underlies the things that we do today.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
You just unpacked a ton of information here. And I'm kind of chuckling at all of the comments that are coming through about folks reminiscing about their memory of punch cards and parents bringing them home.
Hey, how many of them have a memory of paper tape?
Yeah. Yeah, no, not me.
There we go. There's
Paper tape.
And I'm thinking to myself that that, you know, listen to all of the things that you're talking about, try building your own graphical driver, and I'm thinking I can't even be bothered to install some of the games because it involves too many clicks. I'm also thinking how great I am because I know in Excel how to add up a row of columns and give me a total. And yeah, I'm feeling pretty inadequate at the moment right here. So I want to come back to you talked about your book a little bit that you published in 2003 that remains even today sort of one of these quintessential books. It's a really popular one out there, but it really focuses on lean software development. I'd love to get your take. Oh, by the way, before I go on, are you bothered as much as I am that people keep saying it's the 20th anniversary of the Agile Manifesto? Because it's not. It's an off by one error.
It is off by one. I agree with that.
Okay, good.
But that's not what bothers me.
Tell me what bothers you.
Anything that's 20 years old in software is so out of date, we shouldn't be celebrating it. I'm sorry. I have never seen anything last for 20 years and still be particularly relevant. And if we're going to celebrate that this thing happened 20 years ago and we haven't moved beyond it, what's wrong with that?
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel about it.
Love it, love it, love it.
Okay, I'm going to challenge you then. I'm going to
Okay.
challenge you then, because I love your answer. I absolutely love it. And the amount of applause that we just saw from folks on the call, obviously there's a belief that there's things. Your book that you wrote in 2003 now is almost 20 years old as well. Looking back, what would you change in that book? How has that book aged over the last 17, 18 years?
Well, I haven't read it for a while, but I remember when I was writing it, I was told you need to write a book that will never go out of date, because if it's any good, you want to make sure you don't say anything that's dated. And there are a few things in there that are dated, but
Not
those
much.
were thinking tools. And they were actually mostly thinking tools that came from the lean movement, which at that time was already a decade old. Okay. And so I was taking ways of looking at the world, models of thinking about how you do things, and trying to apply them to software. And in so much as it's a set of philosophical thinking tools are a good idea. And some of the basic things are good, but they get applied as practices. And most of the time, those things go out of date too really fast. So where lean has been turned into actual, like, you need to do it this way, these are the practices, I think is probably obsolete. Where they are, how to think about things. It's all about learning. Don't decide too fast, those kinds of things. Think about flow. Those areas, I don't think those have gone out of date, but I'm not positive if you read the book now, you would have as many good ideas as if you read a book that's a little younger. I haven't read it myself for a while, so there you go.
Lean Ideas started being published in the 70s. And people thought, hey, these are good ideas. And they made the mistake in industrial applications of lean of trying to copy the practices. Well, Toyota does this, or somebody in Japan does that, so we ought to do that, and we should get the same kind of benefits. And it didn't work. Does that sound familiar? When all you do is copy practices, you don't get the benefits. What you have to do is look at how people think, how they came to adopt these practices as ways of dealing with the problems that they were facing. And if you understand how they thought, how they came up with the practices, then you can apply the same style of thinking to develop your own practices. And that is still very fundamental. One of the foundational principles is respect people, don't waste their time. That's not out of date. That's what now, 50 years old? It's older than that, I'm sure, but it was articulated in the lean context a long time ago. That doesn't change. We just come up with new ways of wasting people's time. And that's what we have to fight back against.
So when you've been working with clients, let's just say over the last 20 years, or you've been talking to people for the last 20 years, how have you helped, or how have you helped them apply those thinking tools? And I'll tell you where I'm coming from is
Okay.
most of the clients that I interact with, the conversation is just tell me what to do.
Well, that's a bad client. We don't have, we never actually called ourselves consultants, and we never talked about clients. We said we're teachers, and we'll spend, a week, 3 days with you, something like that, and we'll talk to your leadership team, and we'll tell you, I give you ideas about how to think, and then we're gone. And if we qualified everybody we worked with, and we would always at least have a phone call with whoever was the sponsor. And if their thinking patterns didn't match ours, we wouldn't take it. We weren't interested. We weren't looking for work, we were just looking for, so we didn't work with companies that weren't prepared to think for themselves and to basically take a different approach to the way that they thought. The companies we had the most trouble with, almost never had a really good engagement with, were cost centers. Anybody that had a cost center. Because a cost center, the thinking behind a cost center is just not the same. it doesn't allow the people in the cost center to have their own ideas. So we didn't run into the problem because we didn't try to be consultants and because we tried to qualify anybody we were working with. And if they weren't going to like what we had to say, we weren't going to go there.
When you think about the people that you have worked with over the last 20 years or you know, whatever time frame really you want to think about, what is it that you've seen that makes you hopeful that there is a better way for us to work and deliver software and deliver solutions?
Especially in the time frame from 2000 to 2010, the companies that were really good, that we really enjoyed working with, were the companies who had never actually heard about Agile and figured things out for themselves before they heard about any of the practices. And they were so creative, and they did stuff that I was appalled at, but it worked. And then, I mean, and I learned, and so those were the companies that were thinking for themselves and figuring out how to solve their problems without too much help. And even today, I think that the most interesting companies are the ones that are pretty much trying to figure out how to take the smart people that they have and give them the freedom to solve whatever the heck today's problems are, because today's problems are not the same as, you know, even a year ago, because a year ago, we didn't know that we were all going to be home for a year. Think how fast the problems of being home got solved. I mean, everything shut down and you had a week to be home, maybe 3 days, right? No more than that. And it didn't matter if you were a university and your professors had to learn to teach from home, or a kindergarten or an office, everybody cleared out. And everybody figured it out. And it was a little bit hokey to begin with, but if you think about how fast things changed in that window of time when all of a sudden everything changed, that gave me a lot of hope that there's a whole lot of resilience in the ability to leverage technology the way that you need to and to do it fast. And I think we learned, or should have learned, a lot from that. That is, if you just turn people loose, I mean, if you think about any problem, like let's just take curbside delivery. Curbside delivery wasn't a thing. And within weeks, every store around me was able to do curbside delivery in all kinds of different ways, some hokey, some not. So I imagine a team putting together curbside delivery. That was not a team of software people. It was not a team. It was people who dealt with inventory, people who dealt with store staffing, people who dealt with all kinds of different areas, all getting together, maybe 10 of them, and throwing together something and getting it up and running in 2 weeks. And all over the place, all over the world, very small, complete full teams got thrown into problems and had to solve them. And they knew what was good. They knew when they had made progress. Nobody had to tell them that this is what you're trying to achieve. When people can drive up and pick up their groceries, you're good. And maybe they just do a telephone call in, or maybe after a whole 2 months, you can push a button on an app. But it didn't take those teams, anybody telling them what to do. And they were they had everybody on them that needed to get things done. They had like 2 instructions. We need people to be able to order online, pay online, and somebody here in the store puts their order together and put it in their car when they come up, figure it out. And restaurants figured it out. Everybody figured it out. Now, if you think about that, that's the way that very rapid stuff can happen. When you put different kinds of people, give them an obvious problem, they know when they're there, and let them go. And I hope that we learn that that's a really good way of getting stuff done.
What I see is a shift from focusing on meaningless metrics. I'm sure each of you has fond examples, to a focus on the outcome that your work produces and the impact that outcome has. What does the people who are benefiting from the work you're doing experience? That is I think, a shift that has been far too long in coming. It's always been the core of lean in a logistics or a manufacturing or design world. And now I think it's coming to the software world, where we're not looking so much at the meaningless metrics like, the project management metrics, cost, schedule, scope, earned value, and all of that silly stuff. But we're looking at how have we impacted the experience of people who want to get groceries because COVID makes it unsafe for them to go to a store, like us. That I think is fundamental. And that is beyond what we've seen until the last 5 years, and COVID has brought it home.
So why is this so difficult for so many companies and so many organizations?
Okay, well, why is this so difficult? Actually, that's a hard question for me to answer because as I gave you a hint, we don't tend to work with organizations that find it impossible and haven't tended to work with, and actually weren't in organizations that tended to find doing common sense stuff impossible. But I actually think that when you're working with companies where what they do doesn't make sense, okay, doesn't seem right, doesn't seem like they're thinking about the whole thing, there are probably, almost certainly, some metrics somewhere that people are responsible for delivering on that are causing their behavior to be the way it is. And I think that we have measured progress in our companies by financial metrics for way too long, instead of measuring them by how well we serve the people and the communities that our companies are in. And when you walk away from the financially focused metrics, and especially in a cost center, it's like double down on financial focus, and start thinking about more important things like, can people get groceries, or can people get shots, or how many people are immunized, or does this vaccine center actually make people stand around, that kind of stuff. When you start focusing on how is the experience of the people who are benefiting from the work, how well is it doing that job, and you let the people actually setting things up focus on the experience of the people that's using their work, then I think you get way better results, and you get smart people that can apply their intelligence to the real problem instead of an intermediate or proxy problem.
I got a different understanding of what's going on from recent work by Roger Martin. Do you guys know Roger? He was
from your area.
He was head of the Rotman School of Business at Toronto. You know that school?
Oh yeah.
Near you guys.
Yep. Lots of head nods.
Yeah. So anyway, his point in his latest book is that there are two conflicting mental models. One mental model is that the economy, that the work that we do is essentially a machine. And this is the model that was introduced by Taylor back long before any of us were born. And we're all cogs in this machine. And if we optimize each piece in this machine, we are going to have an optimum output overall. Does anybody believe that? Not anymore.
I don't think so, but we did.
But that's the foundation upon which our whole system of organizing business, of organizing education, of organizing our day-to-day work is built. That we break it up into pieces and optimize each piece. I mean, we break it up into software and finance and engineering and customer service and optimize each piece. And where does that lead us? It leads us to a whole bunch of pain.
Well, I would like to say that there are companies that do really well and have followed a different model. And so what I oftentimes like to break the world into sort of companies that got formed before the 90s, before the mid 90s or late 90s, and companies that got formed after that. Because if you look at a large number of the, I don't know, internet companies or software companies, they're built with software as a core competency. They basically don't have any concept of IT departments. And they don't seem to have the same kinds of struggles or problems with thinking about how do I use software to accomplish my organization's purpose, because that's sort of what they were built on. If you go back to banks or insurance companies or energy companies, they were built in a different era where people were afraid of technology, and so their structures are different. And once you have a structure, it's really hard to change that structure. But when you're a brand new company, I mean, admittedly, companies that were formed in the late 90s, they're 2 decades old now, but they still don't have IT departments, and they still have a lot easier time thinking about how do we organize to get stuff done. One of the organizations I like to think about, not that they're ideal, but that they're interesting, and that is AWS. Because AWS puts out and has put out for over a decade massive amounts of what is currently enterprise scale software with small teams doing services. And they do it successfully. And they keep rolling out more stuff. And yet they're not like any other big software company, because they really do operate off of small teams. And they've kind of got that figured out. How do you do that? And if you start taking look at companies that are organized around a different mental model than the optimize the revenue stream of this company or something like that, they're optimized around Amazon clearly are optimized around customer experience. And when you look at the way that they think about what is optimal and what do we measure, then you'll find that there are a bunch of companies out there that aren't using the old industrial model. They've got a different model.
So without going too far down the rabbit hole of optimizing for share price or perhaps optimizing for other things, without going too far down that, we've got 80 people on this call. There are 600 events going on in February alone related to this Agile Festival. Many of these conversations are with people who have already bought in and are already thinking this way. Okay. What are some of the things that we can do to help bring other organizations along for the betterment of society and betterment of all of us as a human race?
Oh,
I didn't say this was going to be easy.
The fundamental thing that we're learning to do is something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt figured out to do. We were facing a very serious hole that the economy was in, based on mental models that just had stopped working. And he did not have a magic bullet, a magic model that would work better. But he had instead a mindset that said, let's try something and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we'll try something different and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we'll try something different and see if it works. That, I think, is what produced decades of prosperity up until the time that I think some of you were born, at which time the Chicago School of Economics introduced this shareholder value theory and everything fell apart. So it's mental models substituting one for another for another. And I think that today we're seeing an evolution of the mental model of how things work. The complex adaptive systems is the mental model that is replacing the engineering, not the engineering model, but the model of the world as a machine to be separated and optimized part by part. But instead we have to look at how things interact. And the focus on outcomes and impacts makes that necessary, because outcomes and impacts don't depend on the operation of a piece of software. They depend instead on the operation of all of the work that a organization does using that software in the context of constantly changing economy.
I'm going to take a little different tack to your question, okay? So I think it depends on where you are. So right now we have grandchildren who are just completing, one is just completing college and the other one is working on a PhD in psychology, okay? So at that age where they haven't chosen a company yet, then choosing what to study and what kind of company to work for is really important, because that allows them to be in an environment that will be good. It's not always easy to find out how a company thinks, but they're actually choosing both professions and places to work where they can see a mindset that they agree with. If you're like their parents' age, our children's age, and you have jobs already, you probably aren't going to change those jobs. So you have to figure out how in the job that you have, you can work for making sure that the people around you are respected and their intelligence is leveraged. Depending upon where you are in management, you have more or less influence on that. But paying a lot of attention to who's my customers, are we doing good or bad for them? Who are my coworkers? Are they able to get as much of their, intelligence poured into what it is that we are doing? Sometimes it's just a matter of making sure that if you're in a diverse organization, everybody has a voice. Diversity does no good when everybody isn't easily heard. You can talk all you want about having various types of people on a team, but if only 2 or 3 dominate that team, then your diversity doesn't do any good. So you need to take a look around you and make sure that everybody around you that might have a voice has a way to talk about it and has a way to be respected. Now, well, we're not working and we're not figuring out where we're going to work. So we're talking to people who are, and we're saying, think hard about how you make sure that all of the people, the really scarce commodity these days is the enthusiasm and the energy of bright, creative people. How do you harness the enthusiasm and energy of bright, creative people? Not by telling them what to do, by giving them problems and helping them think about how to solve them, by allowing them to sometimes make mistakes, by allowing them to be enthusiastic about getting stuff done, about presenting challenges and making sure that what they're focusing on is what's important, is the end customers, the end result of what they're doing. And if you can create an environment where the smart people around you are both being heard and being respected and being able to focus their energies on something that matters, then you can do your part.
Those were 2 absolutely fantastic answers. I'm probably going to have to go back and listen to the recording to get all of the little snippets out of it that I wanted to. Thank you so much for both of those answers. I'd love to go back actually to something you talked about early on about the Agile Manifesto being 20 years old now, and it's probably, software development in 20 years, it's probably lived its course. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and this is actually a question that someone shared with me through the chat window. Thank you, by the way, for doing that. Wondering if it's Agile that needs to evolve or some of the practices. So they're making a distinction here between a very common thing that I see, and I'm sure others do as well, which is conflating things like Scrum with Agile.
Well, you think that would be kind of out of date by now, conflating the 2.
Well, you would think so. I don't know that it is.
Okay, well, that's unfortunate.
But I'm wondering,
tell me what's your question again. Let's get back to what you're trying to ask.
Going back to the Agile Manifesto is sort of what parts of it are out of date, given that it's a series of values and principles. have those values and principles changed, or has
The
something
Agile
else changed?
Manifesto itself, all big change is born out of conditions that are current. And the Agile Manifesto was definitely born out of condition of a focus on making cost centers more efficient and on a focus of a great big waterfall process, okay? And the Agile Manifesto does a really good job of attacking that reality. But that's not today's reality, and it hasn't been for 5-10 years. So the question is, what is today's reality that we need to be thinking about and attacking? And is it so much worrying about whether or not we have what I don't know, what are some of the this over that things?
I can't even remember.
Processes, people over processes. Well, yes, but who's worrying about whether or not artificial intelligence data sets are biased? And why isn't that important? Okay, and what kinds of things is software doing today that who's worrying about whether or not automated vehicles are actually going to, how are they going to make decisions in traffic? And how safe are they going to be? And what is safe enough? And where are those decisions going to get made? And there's so many interesting things that we could be thinking about how what we're doing actually doesn't have necessarily all of the good effects that we expect it to. How is social media messing us up? Not how is it making everybody able to talk, but maybe how is it making, how is it forcing people into chambers where they're echo chambers? So we should be thinking about that stuff. We should be putting that on our list of stuff that's important. And that's not people over processes. I mean, that's taking some of the really hard nuts that we have today, and we should figure out how we should think about cracking them.
The people that wrote that manifesto were all consultants. And as a result, they bid on a project and they were awarded a project and they delivered the project, and they got frustrated by things that made it hard. And so they came up with a bunch of practices and principles that they could use to make it easier for the software people to do what they were told. But the context was always embedded in this concept of the customer, the business, being in control of everything except what the Agile people carved out for being the domain of the software part. And practices, principles, values that are articulated around that subsidiary position of the technical people to the people that control the money, that control the power. I think that part is pretty obsolete.
I'd like to say something more about that. I'm an engineer. I sort of described that at the beginning. There's very little in the area of Agile practices that we would have considered interesting in an engineering department. So I like to think about, I often talk about, say there's an earthquake and you're in Santiago, right? Okay. And you work for a structural engineering department. And you have a lot of work now because there's an awful lot of buildings that might be structurally unsound, and they all have to be inspected, and you have to make recommendations as to what's safe, what isn't, and what kind of remediation is necessary. And structural engineering teams, they'll do that after every earthquake in every city that has earthquakes. That's what they do. And nobody would treat those teams the way software teams are treated. They would not have contracts like our software contracts. The teams would be, you're smart, you have a leader, you know what structural safety is, you go into that building and do a proper examination of it. And if you don't know how to do that, go learn before you try it. And make sure that's safe and come up with decent remediation. So if you look at how engineering groups are treated and the respect for their expertise and their ability to tackle a problem and solve it, whether it's designing a bridge or building a tunnel or doing structural engineering or something like that, most of the Agile Manifesto would be considered kind of like something they would not be interested in. That's like for those kids that do software, not us professional engineers.
Mary, Tom, that is such an awesome way of looking at it. You know, if structural engineers were doing what we do in software today, we would never put up with it. We just wouldn't do it. Why do we?
No structural engineer would put up with it.
Why do we allow it? And how do we move forward?
No idea. When I was doing a control system, we would have meetings, and if those meetings were run like this so-called stand-up meeting that Scrum recommends, we would have been out of there so fast. It is so insulting, the whole concept of treating us like kids, and not allowing us to think. Engineers do not behave that way. And if you think of software engineering as a profession, my son is a professional engineer in civil engineering, and he's actually an expert on indoor air quality. Now, he emailed me, and he was livid after the Boeing crashes of the plane. He said, how can software folks call themselves engineers and have written software that did not take into account more than one input before it drove the plane into the ground? I taught freshman engineers ethics classes. There's no engineer that hasn't learned right on the front that safety is their number one job, and it doesn't matter where they are in the structure. If they're not paying attention to the safety of the ultimate safety of the thing that they're working on, then they don't belong in that job. Now, you tell me that the software engineers should not have been paying attention to the safety of that plane, but people would say, oh, well, they were just. Think about it. That's a really tough problem. Were they or were they not responsible? If they were engineers, there would be no question. Engineers are responsible for the safety of the thing that they're working. They're responsible to know what it's supposed to do, to know what their piece does to make it do that, to know what it constitutes for their piece to do it well, and to make sure that their piece does nothing to impact the overall safety of the thing that they're doing. And a freshman engineer learns that, and when they go to school, because my son taught the classes. And he was just so upset that anybody in software would call themselves an engineer and yet say that they, well, of course, weren't responsible for the plane crash. So you think about that. We don't treat software as an engineering discipline. And since I grew up in engineering departments, because it wasn't actually that much of a discipline by itself, it's hard for me not to think about software as an engineering discipline. And anything that causes it to be, I don't know, much more of a technician rather than engineering kind of environment makes me feel like somebody's got it wrong.
I think we have a rather narrow perspective. Half of all software investment in the world is embedded software. Does embedded software ever attend Agile conferences? I've never seen it.
A few.
Very few.
Very rare.
In general, people that do embedded software have no use for any Agile practices. They would be far inferior to what they do as members of the engineering team developing the products that they are creating software to be embedded in. But we were once invited to an embedded software conference in Bilbao, Spain. And someone said, actually, there's one thing in Agile that would be valuable to those of us in the embedded world. And that one thing is Agile practices let you always be able to prove that what you have done so far is what you intended to do at any stage. This is the whole test-driven, the whole concept that eventually evolved into chaos engineering. That is something that the embedded world can learn. they rejected almost everything else that Agile proposes because they are ways of dealing with the mechanical mental model of the environment we live in. They understand complex adaptive systems, and they have for a long time.
This is, we're coming up against 7 o'clock, and I don't want this to end. Are you okay if we go a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay.
I have, by the way, to say something to what Tom just said. So
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I'm at 3M, and I am a junior, fairly young called engineer. And I am working with people who've been putting control systems on processes, big roll good processes that are in explosive environments, okay? There's a spark there and the whole thing bursts. So all the walls could blow out so you wouldn't actually kill people. I mean, like, safety is so important, and our stuff is electronic, so it can cause sparks, so we have to be careful about that. So I'm working with these guys, and I'm doing what they used to do in wires. And they say to me, well, okay, you can do whatever you want. Here's the general scheme, but you're not touching the safety systems. Those are all going to be manual because we don't trust your computer. And then I went to the plant where some of my systems had actually been installed. And the focus on being safe is so incredibly intense because it's a dangerous environment. So if you think about engineering of safety systems, you think about if I'm in my plant and the power goes off, think about that. I've got all this massive equipment running, being controlled by a computer. How do I make sure that nothing bad happens? Because power goes off. Because there's nothing in all of that equipment in the plant that won't fail sometimes. Every single thing is going to fail. You know it, okay? You build these complicated plants and every single part will fail. Every single thing has to fail safe so that when it fails, because it's not if, it's when it fails, it's not going to do any damage to anything else. So all of these principles of isolated systems and stuff like that are just sort of natural when you're engineering a control system for a very dangerous process. So if you think about everything has to be fail-safe and nothing can do any harm, and it's your job to make sure that that happens. And when you're in that mental model, when you're thinking about all my software, think about how it's used. Think about the people it could hurt. Think about the architecture I need. Think about the systems I have to put on. And you have to think about it all the time. And you always have to think all the way clear through the end, what could happen that could be bad. So if you're in an engineering world, that's how you're thinking. And it's sort of natural for you to see much bigger picture than we tend to see. And I would like to see that this is happening in software, that people are beginning to see a much bigger picture of the impact of what they work on. And they are able to see it all the way clear through to the end.
That's really cool. I know that when I was working with some lean coaches, I got introduced to the idea of safety, quality, cycle time, economics, and talent in that order. And safety was absolutely the first thing that we talked about in anything that we do, working with those folks. I'd love to just tweak this a little bit. Anna asked a fantastic question that I'd love to jump over to, which is sort of to contrast lean with agile. To contrast how agile hasn't changed in 20 years, how would you highlight how lean software development has changed since the inception?
So I don't use lean software development terms anymore. So I'm kind of walked away from that because it can get actually, what I would say is that lean in the 90s led to some really, really bad lean implementations in the 2000 timeframe in call centers and various service centers and stuff like that. So lean became the thing which put pressure on people to be more efficient. And so it became bad. And I see that almost anything, even lean, can be turned into something that is not good when it gets pushed too far. And I remember Ken Schwaber saying years ago that the CMM people were telling him that someday all your good intentions are going to be turned into bad stuff. And he was right. And it doesn't matter whether it's lean or whether it's agile or whether it's CMM or you name it. If it's got this tag and there are consultants that help people do it, it's going to get turned into bad stuff. I've seen bad implementations of lean, bad implementations of agile. It's not the term. It's the concept of actually, one of the interesting things that I find is that we didn't have coaches until Agile came along. That wasn't a role anywhere at all. There were typically supervisors whose job was, certainly in the lean world, what coaches do. But wait, let me finish.
And senior engineers.
Yeah, coaches and senior engineers, right? Tech leads but what the supervisors had that coaches don't was ultimate responsibility for results. And yet they had to get those results through people. And to this day, it bothers me that we don't end up having responsible people. And that coaches don't have to be responsible. And I know historically where that came from in Agile, okay? I know the people that put that mental model in place. And I'm not comfortable with the coaching mental model. I'm not so sure it's the right mental model. It doesn't exist in engineering, by the way. Have you found coaches in engineering? Do engineering departments need coaches? I've never heard of it. And so to me, the idea, although engineering departments always have lead engineers, the guy that's been around forever that understands what you have to do to make sure that things don't go bad, stuff like that. So some of the mental models that are brought by even lean or agile have led to bad results, have led to people not thinking for themselves. And I don't care which label it is that used to be good and turned into bad you use. If you're not encouraging people to solve their own problems and think for themselves and take responsibility for what they do, then you can put any label on it you want. It's not good.
We attended a conference in Japan where the speaker that followed Mary's talk was one of the sensei, one of the very senior folks in the lean world.
In Toyota.
And the first thing he said in his presentation was, okay, folks, ignore everything that Mary said. It's not going to work for you. And what he said instead was, what you have to do is think for yourself. It's not going to work unless you work it out in your context, your problem, your solution, with your people, your customers, your environment. You got to think for yourself. You can't copy practices. And that's true when you're trying to adopt lean in a factory or in a supply chain or anywhere else. If you are copying practices, you are going to fail. And all of the applications of so-called lean that lead to anorexic situations are examples of that. They're just applying formulas, applying practices without understanding how it impacts people and without understanding how the results are going to be achieved. So it's not that lean or the principles are inappropriate, it's that they are reduced to practices and practices get copied. And that is a recipe for failure. The solution, people failed.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, listen, just in the interest of time, I don't want to keep you here all night, but seriously, I could keep this conversation going on all night. But my wife would have something to say about that.
Oh, well, we do have to have dinner one time too.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can wrap this up for us. What's the one parting thought? What's the thing you're most hopeful of? What is it that keeps you going, that keeps you coming out and talking to people like us, people like me, people like all of us on the call? Can you leave us with one parting thought?
I see smiles on faces, and in recognition that, yeah, that's the way it is. That's the way it should be. And back in the early 2000s, we gave some talks at IBM. And the people said, well, yeah, these are all good ideas, but we can't do anything about it. And just a few years ago, we got invited to a company in Seattle area. And one of the people who was in our class couldn't do anything about these ideas, was now a vice principal or vice president. And now she could do something about it. And we've run into that a lot, that the people who are now smiling with respect to comments that we make, observations that we share, are eventually in a position to do something about it. And that gives me a lot of hope.
To me, the fact that really massive amounts of software and computer technology is what got almost everybody in the world through the pandemic in a way that was way more graceful than would have been otherwise had that stuff not been there. That's what I feel great about. We have also 2 very young grandchildren, and one of them started first grade in last fall. And if she's got her own laptop at home, she is a Zoom expert. And she's been doing Zoom classes now for a while, and she's really good.
She teaches us how to do Zoom.
But that's not all. She's very diligent about doing extra work and her homework, and she's figuring out how to learn. Just because she happens to be home doesn't make any difference. She's, I believe, learning probably as much as she would have at school. She was having me help her with some of her exercises, using Zoom to project here so she could show me what she was doing. And I described it to my daughter who teaches, and she says, "Oh, that's second grade stuff. You know, she's really advanced." So I think the technology has helped us so much get through what would have been really much tougher year, and that people all over the world, small teams, just have risen to the occasion and figured out how to make stuff work because they had to. Nobody stopped them. And some of the results are just amazing. I know when my daughter first started teaching home, she teaches 12-year-olds social studies and science. It was really hard, and it's gotten a lot easier. And the kinds of stuff that have come together to make it possible to teach remotely, to shop remotely, to do means that we're never going to have snow days ever again. Everybody will have a computer at home, and if it snows, they'll teach from home. It's simple. You know, if there's so many things that we can now don't have to be present for, because we've learned through software and through technology that we actually can do a whole ton of stuff without physically being there. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think that more people who live in the middle of nowhere are going to get better educations. I think that it's going to be more possible for goods and services to move to areas where they never could figure out how to get it before, because we figured out that you don't have to be there and you can still just about be there. And that makes me feel pretty good.
Well, on that note, Mary, Tom, thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been, by the way, these quick talks that AgileTO has been running are typically 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. There was no way we were squeezing this one into a 30-minute session, and clearly even an hour wasn't long enough. Thank you so much. Your insights, your perspective, your experience is so great. You have no idea. forget everyone else on the call. You have no idea how much I appreciate hearing
Great.
from you and learning, but I think everyone else does too. For those of you that are here, please take a moment and fill out the survey. There's a link posted in the chat window from John Tobin. It's there now. Please make sure to fill that out. We'd love to get your feedback. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us at the AgileTO meetup tonight, especially Mary and Tom, for you for sharing absolutely everything with us tonight. That was so great.
So I'm going to leave now because I'm actually kind of hungry. I'll bet you guys are too.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.